Tshepiso Makwetla winds it down on Africa World Hour.
Exactly 9 o'clock here on Channel Africa, the African perspective. Indeed, this is Africa World Hour. I am Tshepiso Makwetla. Thank you so much for joining us this Friday the 9th of May. And May, as you know, is Africa Month. So we continue bringing you the African perspective from all corners of the world, as we say, from the heart of Africa to all corners of the globe, and countless stories, different voices, different perspectives, and of course the voices that really matters. And your voice is important to us. So as always, we'd like to hear from you. Where are you listening from? Where are you streaming from? And what is shaping the conversations around you? What are the views that matter in your communities? And please share them with our viewers, our listeners. Perhaps it's something that you think should be brought to our attention. We'd really love to hear from you. So reach out to us on the socials, on X, Instagram, TikTok. You'll find us at Channel Africa 1. On Facebook, we are on Channel Africa, simply Channel Africa. Live streaming, if you'd like, you can find that on the DSTV audio bouquet, channel 802, 628 on OpenView, and you'll also find us on the SABC Plus app. So if you want to call through our WhatsApp numbers, here's the number 063-406-9126. Drop us a voice note, send us a WhatsApp, whatever you do call out. All right, let's take you to our top stories this hour. Blasts rang out across Indian Kashmir and the Sikh holy city of Amritsar in neighbouring Punjab earlier today, with the Indian military saying that they were shooting down drones in the worst fighting with Pakistan in nearly 3 decades. More from Neha Punya, our colleague who is in New Delhi.
Well, we've seen another day of tit-for-tat measures being announced, and also both sides trading not just charges but missiles and drones in what is now uncharted territory for the two bitter South Asian rivals. There is now increasingly seeming a point of no return for these two, nuclear-armed neighbors, both sides accusing the other of being the aggressor, and both sides refusing to back down as tensions continue to mount here in South Asia.
And in South Africa, International Relations Minister Ronald Lamola delivered the keynote address at a major influential international solidarity conference on women, peace and security. It's taking place in the capital city of Pretoria. The event brings together voices from conflict-affected regions around the world, including Palestine, Ukraine, and of course several African nations.
These are the women, the people on the ground, dealing with the conflict daily, taking care of children, families, and the conflicts are devastating to them. So bringing them into capacity building that will enable them to help resolve conflict, to mediate, and also to play a role in humanitarian access and assistance. It's a role that the Department of International Relations in South Africa is very proud to see and to be doing, because this will make a very huge impact and contribution in the conflicts in the continent where women are involved and they are playing a role, and also across the globe.
And speaking of the globe, the US President Donald Trump says his administration is aiming to bring the first group of white Afrikaners to the United States next week, who the White House claims have been racially persecuted in South Africa. President Trump says they would be considered refugees who have been forced out of South Africa. Nick Harper has more from Washington, D.C.
Now, we're told, according to the New York Times, who's been looking into this and has seen documents related to the plan, we should see the first arrivals here to the United States next week, potentially as early as Monday. And we're told that they'll be arriving into Dulles Airport in Virginia, just outside of Washington, D.C. The likelihood is that the Trump administration will want to create some fanfare around this, essentially viewing it as a celebration of offering that safe haven to the white South Africans. But bear in mind that this resettlement program for refugees has essentially been shuttered to multiple countries. What we've seen instead is really a fast-tracking of white South Africans through this program, even though the resettlement program remains suspended, for example, to Congolese refugees who've fled conflict.
And Russia today celebrating the 80th anniversary of the defeat of Nazi Germany in World War II, as President Vladimir Putin presided over a massive parade of tanks, missiles, troops through Red Square. Victory Day with Russia marks on the 9th of May, and so the country's most important secular holiday. Dasha Chershova has more from Moscow.
We have seen this large-scale military parade taking place in Moscow's Red Square, a show of Russia's military might and also a show of Russia not being isolated, despite what Moscow says were the Western attempts to make sure Russia is isolated. We have seen up to 30 heads of international states attending this military parade in Moscow. We have seen also the Russian president addressing the military parades, and in his address he was praising the generation that has been fighting to eliminate the threat of Nazism. He also has stressed that Moscow will not allow the distortion of history, the attempts to rewrite history and to diminish Moscow's role.
At the forefront, the most pressing issues on Africa World Hour with Sipiso Makwetla.
Channel Africa.
At 6 minutes past 9, so that were some of the top stories that we're looking at today, and if you'd like to weigh in on some of the stories, your perspective of global world news, please do share your thoughts with us. We are on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok and YouTube, but you can stream us live there at Channel Africa 1 on TikTok and YouTube, as well as Instagram. And on Facebook, as I mentioned, the number is Channel Africa. If you want to send us message on WhatsApp, 0634069126, so you'll be able to follow the conversations, the important conversations we're having this hour, including what's happening between India and Pakistan. Professor Muhammad Muhsin Javad, Dean of the Faculty of Science and Technology at Auric Virtual University of Pakistan, has shared his thoughts on the ongoing conflict between Pakistan and India in the Kashmiri region. He emphasized the shift from religious to economic factors as a root causes of the modern geopolitical tensions, stressing that nations should focus on sustainable resource use rather than conflict. Channel Africa's Michael Mbewe caught up with Professor Javad on the sidelines of the just ended International Conference of Higher Education at the University of South Africa. This is what he had to say.
United Nations is a forum where this whole globe has to sit together and chalk out different issues of the globe. You said that geopolitical. I have another idea, because if you study all the things, geopolitical and economical issue of this globe, I want to draw your attention centuries behind. At that time there was the wars and unrest among the countries on the base of religion. So the religion was the first priority. And second level, that was the personal defense. And on third level was the economy. So you know there are so many wars, battles that based on the religion. But with the passage of 100 years, now most of the wars behind is not political. That is the economics. No, the religion is replaced, is reshaped. So on the first level, there's the economics, and second is the personal defense, as to my idea, and third is the religion. So now the most thing and the technical thing behind all these issues, except one or two, that is the economical issues. And that economical issue is the base of some geopolitical issues. So each and every country and a nation want to have more access to the resources. So it is the battle of to occupy the resources. I'm a professor of science and biology. To my point of view, the nation should think not to occupy the resources. We should think about the sustainable use of those resources. Anyhow, if we are spending monies at the cost of health, as the cost of food, our globe is very beautiful, very handsome. We should not make it ugly. We should send it in a beautiful way to our next generations. So my message is to all where the unrest is, we should realize it should not be the matter of ego. No, the so many things, so many battles are not only the base of the political, that is the base of ego. That exists among countries, that exists among, nations, that among some races. So we should be joined. You and me, if you are a black, I am a brown, and other was a white, but we have all the blood is red.
Indeed, they say blood has no nationality. But on that note, we have seen simmering tensions between your nation, Pakistani, and India in the Kashmir region. This conflict has its origin. It's not the first time that we have witnessed such, clashes. Perhaps maybe give us a brief history. To your knowledge, where does this conflict formulate from?
You know that a subcontinent, when the colonial rule needed to end, in 1947 Pakistan came into being. At that time there was some issue that remained undissolved by, at that time, the regulators and etc. Kashmir is one of that. And at that time there is a United Nations resolution that the peoples of Kashmir should give them the right for own decision, either they want to go to Pakistan, either want to go to India. So that is still undecisive. But after the passing of 72 years, the things are changed, but still India and Pakistan is now becoming atomic powers. Both have the atomic powers at the cost of the base of good education, at the base of good food and shelters, because both nations have invested just for their self-defense a lot of on such kind of that. So my point of view, the both nations should, because now the Pakistan is a reality. India should feel that Pakistan is now the reality. As to my knowledge, might be you can say that I am somehow biased because I am a Pakistani. Because as to my observation, India is still not accepting that Pakistan is a reality. There is some ego issues, and India, on the base of, the land is more bigger than a Pakistan. Pakistan is a small country as compared to India. And a size-wise, we cannot compete and all that. But both sides, we have a same blood, same culture, everything is that. But we should realize our responsibility. And that area is also having some resources for other nations. As I have already said, now the battles are basically not based on some, these are the resources. And there's some disturbing factors. We are the neighbors. We should realize our responsibility in some kush. This present tension that exists because, 2 months before, there was a very horrible incidents held in Balochistan. Some persons hijacked a full train and there are so many casualties. And the Pakistani side has said that it is some, indirect involvement of other nations in which they are believing India and etc. Their agency like RA and etc. But the same case, few days back, I think 13 days ago, there was another incident that happened in Pahalgam in Kashmir. So the India is blaming that the Pakistani is behind that.
And that there was our colleague Michael Mbewe speaking to Professor Muhammad Mohsin Javad, Dean of the Faculty of Science and Technology at the Auric Virtual University of Pakistan. Brings the time to 14 minutes past 9. We speak about a very important issue now, one that I certainly am passionate about. It's U.S. funding for clinical research in South Africa incrementally being cancelled. This is happening through at least two processes. The first is by banning certain kinds of foreign grants called sub-awards. The second is by failing to issue routine renewals of grants for clinical studies in South Africa. To help us look at the situation and what's the root cause behind this, we're joined now on the line by Jesse Kirkland, a journalist for Spotlight and Ground Up, who wrote an article on this issue. Jesse, we're so glad to have you join us. So tell us exactly what type of research is being done at the moment for which funding is being either culled or not being renewed.
Thanks for having me. So, in South Africa, a lot of the research that we get from the National Institutes of Health, which is the big US agency that provides funding for public health research, a lot of the research that South African researchers are doing that they get from that agency is for TB-related research and for HIV-related research. A lot of the studies are clinical studies that are developing new kinds of drugs for TB, new kinds of drugs for HIV. I mean, basically the NIH, it provides a few different kinds, it provides funding in a few different kinds of ways. The one is that a researcher, say in South Africa, might get a grant for a clinical study that they're doing, say, to develop a new drug directly. But another way that researchers can get funding is through something called subawards. So a subaward basically happens when the principal recipient of a grant gets some funding, and then they collaborate with a second research group, and they provide some of their grant funding to that second research group. So, for instance, let's say a group in the United States might get a grant from the NIH to develop, say, a new HIV drug, and they might decide to collaborate with researchers in South Africa and provide some of the money to those researchers in South Africa so that they can test that new drug in South Africa. What's happened now is that kind of subaward process at the foreign level has basically been banned. So you can, the National Institutes of Health has passed a new policy from the 1st of this month, 1st of May, which says that you can no longer provide foreign subgrants. So if you're a researcher in the US and you get provided with a grant, you can't start providing some of that grant money to a foreign research group that you're collaborating with. And in the South African context, that has huge ramifications because researchers get far more money from subgrants than they do from direct awards. So a lot of researchers that are, developing new TB drugs, new HIV drugs, are essentially having to halt the clinical studies that they were running as a result of that decision.
And just tell me, Jesse, the cuts, has there been any explanation, or is it part of the ODA cuts that we're seeing, particularly from the US?
Yeah, so I mean, there are a couple of processes that are happening. So the one that I've discussed is, it affects researchers globally. They're trying to stop subgrants to researchers across the world, and part of that is due to their general attempt to cut costs and cut the amount of money that they're spending either on aid or on research grants to other parts of the world in order to cut US debt. And there are also a range of other political reasons for why they're cutting subgrants specifically, which maybe I won't go into because it's quite a long story. But there's also something happening which is specific to South Africa. So I mentioned that subgrants, for instance, are being cut, but in the South African context specifically, even researchers with direct awards from the NIH are struggling to get those grants renewed. And often researchers aren't given, a very specific explanation about why that's happening. But we know from internal emails and internal memos within the NIH that have been leaked to the press that NIH officials are basically being instructed to hold and suspend grants to South Africa. And that has to do with the current U.S. administration's hostility toward South Africa.
And, I'm just thinking that the irony of it, of course, is a lot of this funding originated at a time when South Africa was facing criticism for what was referred to as AIDS denialism, and we have been praised continually for the amount of work that we've done, the manner in which access to healthcare services and, of course, medication, treatment has burgeoned over the years. But now, for different political reasons, which you say could also be partly to do with specifically South Africa, when we most need it, when we're making strides in health and innovation from a medicinal point of view, this is when the funds are being yanked.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's worth pointing out that South African researchers are sort of global leaders when it comes to developing new drugs for HIV and TB. And those innovations that those South African researchers have developed, they don't just benefit people, say, with HIV or TB in South Africa. They benefit people with those diseases around the world. So, for instance, there's a study that's going on now that's just been cut due to these US funding cuts that was trying to develop a shorter TB treatment regimen. Currently TB treatment lasts 6 months, and these researchers are developing a new TB treatment regimen that would only last for 3 months, which would make it much easier for people to finish their full course of TB treatment. That would be incredibly helpful for for attempts to combat TB around the world. And the US faces sporadic TB outbreaks. It's true that they don't have as big of a TB problem as South Africa does, but it is still, a disease that's present there in certain parts of the country. And so, yeah, I mean, it's, despite the fact that, as you say, we're sort of leaders in this field, we are being affected for reasons that are political rather than the quality of the science that we're producing.
And just where does that leave medical researchers? As you say, we have some world-renowned researchers in this country, leaders in the field of medicine, science and technology, even South Africa, setting up its own facilities for vaccine creation and innovation. So where does it leave us? Does it mean that we're going to see even further brain drains? Because if you can't do the work here, you obviously will want to go somewhere else.
Yeah, that's quite possible. I mean, these decisions have, bad effects for South Africa, as you say, because, researchers might try to go elsewhere, but they also have a terrible effect on our efforts to reduce the burden of infectious diseases. And as I said, I mean, researchers are being affected not just in South Africa, but around the world. This decision about subgrants, for instance, to cut subgrants, has a very dramatic impact on research just going on around the world, because the majority of grants that researchers get from the NIH outside of the United States come from subgrants. And what we're talking about here is just billions and billions of rands. And so, there are a lot of potential answers that we could have come up with about new ways to treat TB and HIV that might not be found anymore because of these funding cuts.
Just very quickly, Jesse, are you able to shed some light on how much so far researchers have been able to receive from this National Institute of Health funding scheme?
So there are a few different figures that have been reported on. It's somewhere between 3 and roughly 7 billion rand a year that we were getting from the NIH. And I mean, as far as how much has been cut goes, it's tricky because, the way that the NIH grants work is a researcher will get, say, a 4-year grant, and they'll be provided with the first year's worth of funding. And by the end of that first year, there will be a routine renewal of those funds, and you'll get a second year's worth of funding. And the way that a lot of researchers are losing their funds in South Africa particularly is that whether they receive a direct award or an indirect award, when it comes time to renew the grant, they're unable to do so. So there are a number of researchers, for instance, right now who might still have NIH funding in the sense that they got their grant renewed, say, 6 months ago, and they now still have another 6 months left worth of funding. But by the time, in 6 months' time, when it comes time to just have a routine renewal of their grant, they will probably struggle to have that funding resumed. A lot of research groups in the country are operating under the assumption that essentially all NIH funding for South African researchers will not be resumed.
Of course, we'll be keeping an eye on this, particularly on the developments that will likely come up at the World Health Assembly that are funding models and funding public health, where South Africa will place itself, and of course, including the African Union, to see what member states are saying there in the face of these huge aid cuts. Jesse Copeland, journalist with Spotlight and Ground Up. Thank you very much for speaking to us about this article that he's written about US funding for clinical research in South Africa incrementally being cancelled.
Out and About with Puleng Mulibatsi.
Me Patricia Delil with us talking about just the growth and the development that South Africa is experiencing in terms of the tourism sector, which is also one of the driving contributors to the growth of the South African economy. What would you say are factors that are driving the positive trajectory in South Africa's tourism sector, Minister?
The whole value chain. And, I always get feedback to say that, South Africans are so friendly, the Ubuntu spirit. So our people are our biggest asset. And what we've also seen is that South Africa's value for money, and that we are eternally grateful for our African brothers and sisters. Because in 2023, we received 8.5 million visitors, and 6.5 came from the continent.
Minister of Tourism, Patricia Delil.
Out and About comes to you every Saturday, 9 till 12 noon, Central African Time. Africa World Hour. Africa World Hour. Unpacking global headlines from an African perspective.
And we continue giving you more news from the continent and beyond, the latest developments, and of course, as we say, the voices and the perspectives that matter here on Africa World Hour. I am Tshepiso Makwetla. So we're talking about Human Rights Watch saying that United States should not forcibly transfer migrants to Libya, where inhumane detention conditions are well documented, based on numerous media reports citing U.S. officials. The Trump administration saying it may be poised to imminently deport an unknown number of detained migrants to Libya. For more on this, we're joined on the line from New York by Bassam Khawaja, Deputy Middle East and North Africa Director at Human Rights Watch. A very good evening to you. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us.
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
So, a U.S. judge has ruled that the government cannot immediately proceed with deporting people to Libya. But that is a temporary solution for those like yourselves who are critical of doing this. The Trump administration, though, is that likely to heed the warning, the judge's ruling?
So we don't know. The Trump administration has defied court rulings on this in the past. I mean, I think the bottom line here is that they shouldn't even be considering sending people to Libya. We have media reports that a number of detainees were taken by bus to a military plane on Wednesday. They sat there for several hours before the judge blocked these deportations. And so, there's a few things to flag about Libya. First is that this is an extremely unstable country with two governments vying for power. The detention centers in control are not really under government control. They're often under armed groups, militias, who are kind of semi-affiliated with governments, but often highly abusive and not within the government's control. And then the detention conditions there, it's not just that they're bad, they are kind of unspeakably horrific. Some of the worst places that people are locked up anywhere in the world. Human Rights Watch has for 2 decades now documented torture, killings under torture, rape and exploitation in prison, really some of the worst things that humans do to each other. And so the idea that the Trump administration would be sending people from the U.S. into these conditions without any semblance of due process is really horrific and not something that they should even be considering.
Do you have any ideas as Human Rights Watch as to the number of detainees that are there in the United States, and specifically where, if you have any figures at all?
We don't have figures on this. We know, according to the media reports that we do have and some of the court filings, at least a dozen were kind of put on buses to a military plane this week. If we look at kind of other countries, the U.S. has sent hundreds to places like El Salvador, to Panama, to Costa Rica. Again, it's hard to say because the administration is not releasing any clear information about this. Trump himself this week, when asked about it, said simply he doesn't know, which is a shameful response to accusations as serious as this. And we should say that both Libyan governments have denied any kind of deal. And so, again, the level of information on this is quite limited. What we do know is that people were reportedly put on buses and that a court has now blocked this order. But of course, as you said, that's a temporary protection and it is not sufficient at this point.
So before we get to the conditions which you say have been well documented for detainees in Libya, the Libyans who are in the United States, do we know how many of them have arrived there? Are there some who have been trying to seek some sort of asylum, refugee status, or who are there illegally as a result of whatever reason?
So, and I should say, these aren't Libyans who are being told they're going to be deported to Libya. I think from what we know, they're citizens of Vietnam, of the Philippines, of Laos, one citizen of Mexico. I mean, people from completely different parts of the world.
So it's the sort of discussion that the U.S. is having with Rwanda, for instance.
Exactly. And so it's even more outrageous that he would be saying, I mean, it would be one thing if he was saying we're going to be deporting Libyans back to Libya, and then it's a case of, do they have a specific case of asylum? Is there a reason not to deport them? Are they getting due process? That's one conversation. But here we're talking about other migrants who are detained in the U.S. being told that instead they're going to be taken to detention centers in Libya, where they have no family, no relatives, there's really nothing for them there. They'd be isolated in a place on the other side of the world.
But I'm glad that you actually cautioned me there on my assumption, because for it to make sense, that is what I always thought, that surely this must be Libyans. It was so improbable to me that you literally, it's almost like trafficking of humans and undesirables. You pack them up in a bus or on a boat and you just ship it off as long as you get them off your shores. So what has been the human rights argument in court? If this is a temporary order, has there been no direct challenge about I know there are international conventions that the U.S. is not signatory to because it doesn't want to be held accountable on, but has there been an argument around the constitutionalism of this, the human rights aspect of this?
So you're correct that the U.S. often kind of avoids signing human rights treaties, but actually, I mean, on the specific case of deporting people to places they face torture, it has signed a number of binding treaties, including the Convention Against Torture. I mean, both from domestic and international law, this is plainly illegal. There is no legitimate argument that they could send people to these types of conditions. As you said, again, I mean, this is much more, I think we can say plainly, this is a case of the government trying to use the most extreme examples to scare people in this country to say, look, if you're in the United States as a migrant, you risk being sent somewhere across the ocean where you will potentially face torture. Again, I don't think there's any world in which we can have a conversation about this as a normal immigration procedure. This is very clearly something that's being done to terrify people with good reason.
And I'm actually just wondering about the conditions under which they are being kept in the United States, those very detainees, let alone the kind of conditions that they hope to face or they will face wherever they're going to be deported to.
Yeah, so there's quite a bit of documentation about problems in detention facilities in the U.S., and this has been an ongoing issue for many years. And Human Rights Watch has covered that. But again, the situation in Libya is just of a different kind. It's not, I mean, even some of the deportations to El Salvador were to a very notorious prison. Conditions there are extremely harsh. Libya is not even, we're not even talking the same language when we talk about detention conditions in Libya. These are places that are essentially holes in the ground under the control of unaccountable militias. Where people, would very likely face very extreme violence and potentially trafficking. There also, we should say, there's no provision in Libyan law to take in detainees. So this would, even within Libya, be an extra legal procedure. And then the Libyan judiciary is, fragmented. It's unworkable. We've been documenting this for many years. And so even if someone were to be deported to Libya, there's no way they would have any legal process to challenge that, to be able to get out of detention. In essence, you'd be sending people, to prison for the rest of their lives in a country that is not theirs, where they have no rights and are facing serious violence. I mean, the idea that we're even having a discussion about this is outrageous.
And just on that, I am curious because in some cases, the suggestion has been a trade-off, pretty much that I pay you to take off my hands people that I feel are, undesirable. Is this the case in this conversation about Libya?
We don't know. There's certainly been media reports about, some sort of deal, but there aren't a lot of details about it. And so, at the best, we'd be speculating. Certainly in other cases, the Trump administration has paid countries to take in detainees. But again, these are human beings we're talking about. This isn't the case of, I have an unwanted thing I want to put in your country. These are human beings with rights. And again, this is the conditions that we're talking about here are so atrocious that we should not even be having this conversation. And there are legal requirements in the U.S. If the Trump administration wants to deport people, there is a process for that. They are obliged under domestic and international law to follow that process. They can't put people on military planes in the middle of the night in defiance of court orders and ship them around the world. That's unacceptable under either domestic or international law.
Bassam, thank you so much for your time and sharing that with us. Much appreciated. Bassam Khawaja, Deputy Middle East and North Africa Director at Human Rights Watch, speaking to us from New York about their reactions to news in the US that the Trump administration is going to forcibly transfer migrants to Libya. That's their intentions. That's despite a court order saying that the administration needs to halt a bit, that it cannot immediately proceed with these intentions. Brings the time to 23 minutes to 10.
The Morning Switch Weekend with the Shy Guy.
Just the other day, I went to pick up my daughter from school, and as per usual, her friends, they usually come to my car just to say hellos and goodbyes. So this particular day, they made this comment about my jacket, saying that it's giving baddie vibes.
You say my jacket is giving what?
It's giving baddie vibes. It got me thinking, where did the baddies come from? Because nothing is new under the sun, as it is said. I was like, oh yes, remember the Kenyan parliamentarian? Her name is Millie Odhiambo.
When you are urging me to be a good example to the girls, the younger ones who are doing their first term, Mr. Speaker, if they are good girls, they'll never get corner office. Be as bad as Millie Odhiambo, you will be the mother of this house. So do not be cheated like the African culture, where you are told have decorum, be nice. I'm telling you, you will go nowhere. Be a bad girl like me.
And I thought to myself, that is the original baddie.
Saturday and Sunday mornings belong to the Morning Switch. 3 to 6 a.m. Central African Time. Africa World Hour. Africa World Hour. Unpacking global headlines from an African perspective.
And of course, we are unpacking headlines across the continent, across the world, and some of the stories that are happening in your corner of the world certainly are conversations that are being carried in other parts of the world. And this is one such story that has wide appeal in terms of public discourse. So please note that the following report contains content that may be upsetting to some listeners or viewers. Counsel for Selby Mbenenge, president of the Eastern Cape Division of the High Court of South Africa, says he's concerned over a witness's failure to produce evidence from her phone that Judge's Secretary Andiswa Mengo forwarded an explicit picture to her, allegedly from the top judge. The alleged incident is in dispute and is a critical issue in the sexual harassment probe. Mengo alleges that Judge President sexually harassed her via in-person interaction and electronic communication between June 2021 and November 2022. Kenny Mapanga has more on this.
The cross-examination of fellow Judge's Secretary Ntomboxolo Jobela, a colleague of Andiswa Mengo, saw her cornered over her failure to produce evidence to support the allegation that Mengo received a sexually explicit image, allegedly of the top judge's private parts, and then forwarded it to her. But Jobela testifies that she no longer has the phone that received the image.
This is not clear now, Council. Am I supposed to be producing this from my phone?
Yes.
Ewe. I don't even have that phone that I used back then.
While questions remain on this event, evidence leader Advocate Sulume Skeepers moved to the Director of Court Operations for the Eastern Cape Division of the High Court, Denham Khokwana, who in his testimony confirmed further aspects of Mengo's version. Khokwana confirmed that Mengo reported the alleged incident in the chambers of the Judge President to him.
She said that she was called by the JP to his chambers. And once they got into the chamber, she says the JP said that she should see the effect that she has on him.
Khokwana further confirmed that he was asked by Mengo to organize a roundtable to solve the alleged issue, as per Mengo's previous testimony.
And I was liaising between the Judge President and her until the incident when Miss Mengo put up the WhatsApp messages that were exchanged between her and the JP on her status.
Her WhatsApp status?
Yes. That process fell through.
The roundtable process?
The roundtable process fell through because of that.
The tribunal continues on Monday with further witnesses. Kani Mapanga, SABC News, Johannesburg.
And we continue to speak about the Mbenenge Tribunal, but also try and make sense of this. What we would normally not be focusing on is the use of emojis and why they are important. To speak to us about what we're seeing and why it's important to situate it in the sexual harassment allegations or probe that is being made. We are now speaking to Mr. Mpumelelo Zikalala, who's going to tell us from Zikalala Attorneys what his impressions are about this. So, Mr. Zikalala, a very good evening to you. And firstly, thank you very much for taking the time to speak to us. Is this a first in a South African legal trial where emojis take such center stage on a matter such as this?
Good evening to you, and also good evening to our viewers. I would say certainly it is, especially in a case where it's containing or it involves one of the judicial officers or an officer of the court, which is in this case a judge president. So it then becomes important in the manner of communication, what was communicated to whom, and what was the impression or the end result of that particular communication. So it becomes an integral part of the charges as they are, an integral part of the assessment that need to be done by the tribunal to then assess. Was this line of communication one which is acceptable within professionals, or was it a mark or a bound overstepped in this case when it came to a relationship between a judge and a judge's secretary?
And to a point where a forensic linguistic had to be employed to speak to the tribunal about the use of some of these symbols, digital symbols. And it sounds innocuous enough when we say the use of a banana, a peach, eggplant, dripping syringe emojis. But what we're talking about here is their sexual connotations. Again, is this a generational matter? Is it because of the digitized economy that we live in that what would be socio-cultural norms have actually become very slippery slopes?
It definitely it is, and it also comes back to the interpretation of what is there and how to interpret these different emojis, and what do they exactly mean in the conversation that two people would be able to have. So because the tribunal is not in a space where they're not experts in identifying emojis, you then need evidence which is going to be laid that says, when you use this type of emoji, this is what is required. When you engage in this type of emoji, this is the type of information in which you are trying to transmit. Especially in a transgression or an alleged transgression where there are communication or words that have been spoken that, if interpreted, will then be able to prove that indeed a transgression has taken place, linked with whatever which is being tried to prove. So it has certainly put us on a different level in terms of the type of evidence and the manner in which we interpret evidence within the tribunals. And I'm certainly sure that from tribunals, it is definitely going to move within the main courts, in which we see these linguistic experts going in there to say, we are going to interpret what was being meant by these two parties. Hence, this is what must be accepted by the presiding officer.
And what is, of course, equally intriguing is that the judge is himself going to call his own emoji expert. Does this further drive home the point that what we think are social norms, especially if the relationship that's being queried is the level of consent in how they are engaging?
Well, on a technical basis, when come against you, you need one which is going to say something of the opposite, and that evidence is sort of cancelled out. And especially if they don't agree with each other, then it opens up a space in which then the tribunal can then be able to rule who's wrong and who's right. In this instance, where you are dealing with a matter that has not been dealt with by our courts before, it's a new terrain, something that we don't have a lot of jurisprudence on. Certainly, you are going to find a lot of experts which are going to come through. So it's not surprising that for a lack of a better word, the judge president or the accused in this manner is going to bring their own expert to say, this is what I meant, this is what this particular emoji means. If you put them together and you're trying to make it into a sort of a sentence, or speaking with those emojis without full sentences, this is what was being transmitted, and this is what I was saying, if he is going to admit that those emojis were really sent by him.
And you spoke earlier on about barriers. So what I find interesting is that what came out in court in trying to gauge where the barriers began and ended, if at all, where what would be considered polite, what would be considered professional, was the pointing out that it helps that both isiXhosa speakers. So how does this fall into the whole realm of social linguistics? Does that mean that if we speak one language, our interpretation is likely to be the same, including that of your intentions?
Yes, it would be, especially when it comes to certain semantics which are going to be there in words. So there are going to be things which are going to be spoken about in the third language. For example, in respecting someone who speaks isiZulu, I wouldn't say Mr. So-and-so is asking for this. I would ask, is Ubaba saying 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, just to make sure that I understand them correctly. It's not to mean that I'm being disrespectful to them or maybe moving them away from the conversation. It's just the manner in which the language or the culture then requires one to behave. So you must then come back and say, would a reasonable person speaking isiXhosa or within this particular cultural group behave in this manner? Would they continue to talk about things which are in this manner, or was a bound overstepped in the manner in which they were communicating? Especially if you have a relationship that has been clearly indicated, that of a judge president and that of a judge's secretary. So the manner and the type of things in which you are going to discuss, they have to be professional. If you go over the line and maybe talk about socio-economical things, it can't be things which are that deep as if you are talking to your friend. Unless if that was the nature of the relationship at the start, and it was accepted that this is how we are going to do things, and this is how we handle each other. Not recommended, but it is not something which is against the law.
It's not against the law, and I'm wondering if country context matters. So if we are then bringing into the conversation the understanding of international scholars on what can be deemed as having sexual connotation, especially if we're talking about fruits and vegetables. How does that then land itself into the legal realm?
Well, it talks about the communication and what is required, what is transmitted. Now, I want to highlight three things. One is the Cybercrimes Act. Within that particular legislation, it talks about the incitement of violence. Now, I can be able to incite violence without saying a thing and simply sending emojis, and the person on the other side could understand what I'm talking about. The other one is criminal injury, which is a common law crime, in which I could also communicate the same message through emojis. So if emojis and GIFs, if I'm calling them correctly, can then be utilized to make sure that communication is done from one party to another, which is understood in the context of what that communication means is understood. Then it means it's going to form part and parcel of the evidence. It's the first of its kind, certainly going to come and going to be developed as we move along. But what this case has been able to establish is that emojis, even though they are not an official language, they can be a form of communication that can be accepted by a tribunal, incidentally by a court of law. So you must be very careful when you are sending them. But most importantly, we then need a specialized expert which are going to come in and say, what do they mean? Do they mean the same for everything to every single person, or they carry different interpretation, and context is very important when dealing with them.
I really do appreciate you giving us the explanation to the legalese, what is being, as you say, unprecedented to some extent, being analyzed in court. Mpumelelo Zigalala, legal expert of Zigalala attorneys, just speaking to us about the Mbenenge tribunal. Very, very interesting. That brings the time now to... It's 9 minutes to 10. So we did mention the fact that we're going to delve into this particular issue from various angles. So that was what was happening in court. And Shayla is here early to join me for this conversation, because I thought, you and I would most certainly have some sort of, what do you call it? Agreement. There will be some sort of sharing of minds around this issue, and I thought we'd do it like a Q&A session, but at the same time it's like a girls' tea. I've invited a colleague of ours, Tagazelo Dlamini, who is a digital media practitioner, expert, to join us to talk about this. And hey, but Bafazi. So, Tagazelo, good evening, welcome, thanks for joining us. Okay, let me see if Tagazelo is back on the line with us. Tagazelo?
Good evening.
Oh,
Good
there
evening,
you are,
everyone.
lovely. So
Good evening, everyone.
I'm with my colleague Shayla Ndukumana here. I was just saying to Mr. Zigalala that, and it's not a laughing matter, it's actually quite, and that's why it's such a slippery slope, right? That
is true.
Because as the forensic linguistic was saying, actually, these people were not drawing up a grocery basket, speaking about the bananas and the eggplants and the...
Yeah. It's such an interesting conversation to have, Tepiso, because as someone who's been in the digital media and digital content industry and sector for almost 15 years now, I can safely say that it would be impossible to have mastered the different interpretations of what an emoji would be or would mean for instance, someone of my generation as compared to someone of a different generation, because I think those things are so nuanced for the most part. I could possibly, you and I could think this conversation is amazing, it is great, and so I would then possibly send you a fire emoji to express to you how important and how great the conversation is.
Mm-hmm.
Someone else may interpret that to be the conversation was bad and it went up in smoke.
Oh, who would have thought about that, hey?
In actual fact. People, it's so amazing. It's so amazing because there's no uniform interpretation for these conversations.
When you're saying that, and I'm looking at Shayla because these are subject matters you deal with on hotlines.
Yeah.
Intergenerational conversations. Let's just drill down to it. If there is a sexual relationship between an older man and younger woman and vice versa, I think that's where the pitfalls, the landmines really put themselves there. Tell me what happens there.
So here's the thing. We can't put age as a precursor because people have TikTok and they catch up and they know what the perceived view of an eggplant is. Or maybe they don't know.
I didn't know what a peeled banana was.
Ma'am, you know what? I was today years old, but that doesn't matter. That's not the conversation. I think the reality is that you cannot put age as a precursor in this present day and age, especially because we're in an information age, right?
Yeah.
And so for you to sort of steer it and say, but there is a huge age gap between the two, we'd need to study what they've been exposed to. Because
but I think that's precisely my point, Shayla, that what I might think is innocuous. For instance, a peach to me was a peach. Okay. And I was in a grocery shopping list. I like peaches.
Yes.
So, and I think what I'm trying to say is that there is an assumption that because you either have a phone or a software that allows you those options, and like I said, jump in here and smack my hand if you feel that, but
I know
there's that thing that I think I know. And for me, a lot of emojis has been a matter of interpretation. Selazol and I were speaking about the nerd emoji. For me, I knew it was a nerd because I'm a nerd, I guess.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. The thing is, can I jump in there for a second,
please.
Ladies? What is important to note also is that when there is intergenerational communication, that's where the landmines are. Because for some people, one way of interpreting that same emoji may be different to the next person. I'm not sure if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
So for instance, if I've had many instances where some of my relatives who are of a different generation would send me a good morning, my child text, for instance. And then by some twist of fate, or maybe because they don't know, they'd even add an emoji that actually means death or I'm having a bad day. So for me, it's always a slippery slope when the older generation start using a form of a language, because it is a language, a form of a language that they're not completely knowledgeable of the meaning behind. And also being very aware of the fact that with every year that passes, there are different additions to this language that we're talking about. So you have to then also be mindful of the fact that you have to keep in touch with the newer generation and the younger generation, and what now could possibly be a different meaning to the thing that you thought for 5 years was just an orange peel or a banana peel, for instance.
Shayla looks like she's got her...
I want to interject, and I want to interject because there was a study done by Frontiers in Psychology, and what they found is that people sending each other positive emojis, so the smile, the happy face, the blushing face, and so forth, that produces trust between two people. But the negative emojis, like the skull, perhaps, or the X sign, right, that had little to no effect. So what does that mean in this context? As in, we do not perceive negative emojis and sort of feel the tension that would come with a skull, right? And so you don't instantly feel death, is the reality. You look at the skull and it's perhaps not the nicest thing to see, but you move on. And so I want to bring that twist into the context.
And I'm glad you took it there, because I recently had a thought. I was speaking to someone who we've recently gotten to know each other. So it would be filial love. Yeah. Okay. And so he was responding back and he sent me a heart. And I thought, gee, heart emoji. And I thought, I never would have thought of sending you a response back with a heart emoji, because what does it really mean? Am I becoming fresh with you? Because... So I don't know if it's necessarily just about the negative emojis, even the ones that would seem like I heart you. Like it's not that deep for some people, but for some people it is.
Yeah,
that's true. And also, for instance, where do you draw the line? Where do you draw the line between, for instance, using the emoji with a person laughing and there's just two teardrops coming out their face, as opposed to the other one where someone is laughing to the point where they're crying? How funny must the joke be that I must decide which is which? There's so many nuances to this that it becomes very murky and very interesting when you have it in a formal situation and a formal, and then it comes to, especially in this case where it now has even come to the fore and is being deliberated in a legal context.
So I want to just end as we hand over to Sheila, not as in you're going just here, it's tough, but I want to have this conversation because there's also there are light moments about serious stuff, right? So, and I'll go last because I have to think about this because I make so many mistakes, but what was the one emoji that you used and you were embarrassed by, and actually when you realized that it's your interpretation is so wrong, but you still laughed at yourself? Star, have you had any moments like that?
It didn't happen to me personally, but someone sent me that cool emoji. You know, the one with the person wearing
with the sunglasses.
The sunglasses. And it was a context. The context of the conversation was a professional conversation, and then that person used that emoji. And so for me, after having that very serious conversation, for you to then have used that, it kind of it drove home the fact that sometimes we do use these emojis in the most inopportune and inappropriate. Well, I wouldn't say inappropriate in that context, but I can only imagine if that person had used possibly a more out of line emoji. So I think that's the closest I got to the incorrect use of an emoji, obviously with the relative who then sent me the skull to say good morning. That was very interesting for me.
Oh, goodness. Oh, wow.
I'm just thinking about that emoji where, what are they, like dribbling or what is it?
Which one?
I know you know it. There's that emoji where like somebody's like, they're dribbling or I don't know if they're salivating, and I keep thinking,
yes.
You know the one I'm talking about?
One of the most recent added ones.
Yes.
That's a
tricky one.
It's a tricky one.
Food only, please.
One of those that you use.
You want to eat
in
food.
A sexual
the food got people in trouble.
I think that one is one that you do not want to send to your boss. That is one.
Please.
If you want to keep your job. If you want to keep your job.
I think if you still like paying your bond, maybe not.
Shayla, what's your one?
It has to be the heart. So it wasn't embarrassing, but you kind of need to gauge. Do I send a white one? There are options, right? There are colors. Do I send a green one? Do I send a black one?
That is so true.
You need to gauge. What am I sending? The really strong redded one. So there's one that's burgundy and there's one that's just simply red. So do I send you that one to show that I'm really trying to convey some level of sentiment? That.
So please tell me, those of you who obviously know more, what's with the colors of the heart?
Because
is there like a friendship heart?
Listen, there's a heart for all contexts. That's how.
What's the context of white heart?
Peace is how I feel. Peace, a calm, a good warmth.
A yellow heart?
Yeah.
I don't
purple
know.
Heart? You know the color purple as it can be dangerous. In terms of misinterpretation, the color purple.
But this would mean...
So a purple heart, tell me you won't be thinking twice about it.
I would never send it. Because what are you going to interpret from it?
See?
You know what I find also very interesting of late is the fact that, you know how WhatsApp, for instance, has now changed the race, I guess you could call it, of the emojis. So in the past, all of the emojis would be yellow.
Yeah.
So if you wanted to send, say we had a group chat, the three of us, and I just wanted to tell you I'm celebrating and I love this, and I would want to send the dancing lady, for instance.
Yeah.
And instead of sending the dancing lady and she would be in yellow, now you can choose whatever color you want her to be in. So you could even go as far as like my complexion of darkness.
Yes, I love that. That's my favorite.
Even when I use a thumbs up, I go out of my way to make sure I find the one that's closest to my own complexion.
The darker the berry, the sweeter the juice.
Exactly.
Ma'am, are you sure you want to say that?
That's exactly why I said it like that. Well, let's end it there. Let's end minute, there's time. Thank you so much for
Thank you so
the
much,
education and joining the conversation. That's exactly why I said that, because it sounds so innocent, the duck, the berry.
It does, and it's such an important conversation to have, because you don't want to find yourself in a situation where you have sent something that is misinterpreted. I think it's I think my parting shot for this conversation would be just make sure that, especially if it's people you are not used to, people you don't have an intimate relationship with, just be very sure which interpretation of the emoji that you're using they may conceive it to be.
Don't go shopping with a basket full of fruits and veggies.
No.
Don't talk about shopping. Leave it. It's okay. There's no need to discuss it at this point.
You know, actually, what I was just saying, finally, when I said the darker the berry, the sweeter the juice. And for me, like, it's a visceral memory, and it's real. We used to go to our neighbors. They had the mulberry tree.
Yes.
And indeed, the darker the mulberry, the sweeter it was. And you'd come stained, and that's why you get a good beating, because they knew what you were up to.
Yeah, not in 2025. In 2025, these mean different things.
Yeah, Me Too. The Me Too movement is here for a reason. Thakazolo, thank you very much. Thakazolo Dlamini, digital media specialist, and Shayla Ndukuma. You have hotlines coming up.
Yes, ma'am. So in the first hour, we're going to be talking Upendo Letters. Upendo Letters is people sending through their issues in relationship, right? Looking for some level of counsel. And today we're going to have Bahumi, who is our celebrity guest, and she's going to be giving us counsel with respect to these letters. So they range from relationship issues with your partner to perhaps a parent that isn't showing you the right kind of love, or even a colleague who you're looking to interact with more outside the spheres of work. And so that happens in the first hour. Then in the second hour, we get into Hot 6 Hot Songs. This is an offering by our Malawian correspondent, Kondwani Nyamasauka. And he'll be letting us know what songs are currently trendy in the African continent.
Oh, beautiful. You know, I just had a thought when you say your colleague whom you'd like to spend time with outside of work. There goes that conversation again. How would you even put it? Shayla?
Where are you going?
I was just thinking, how would I phrase it? That I'd really like to spend more time with you outside.
Why can't you just say that?
Because people are just so complicated these days.
No, but you say that, and based on their response, you take the hint. So if they are uncomfortable, you stay away. It's okay. I think the reality is that we want to interact with one another, but we want to do this in the spaces of barricades that keep us safe. And that, for me, is problematic.
But remember, those barricades, those barriers are there for a reason.
Yeah.
Because just very quickly to end off on this, my cousin and I were speaking about we're taking up golf, and she was saying the sales guy kept calling her sweetheart. And we're like, no, sweetheart is not the way to go to get the sale. And he probably just think it means it's all right, it's okay.
Yeah. But this is where honesty plays in. Be honest. Say, hey, this is uncomfortable. I hear you, but this is uncomfortable. And I think we minimize on that. We shortchange honesty for pride. We shortchange it for standing my ground by avoiding the person or saying things that you wouldn't say to this person who's bothering you to someone else.
Or cultural politeness. That's also what it is, isn't it?
I just feel like, be honest. There is a way to be honest.
Well, I'll be honest. I'll be true to myself and say good night.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for joining us here on Africa World Hour, crossing over into Hotlines, 8 minutes past 10. Shayla, it's over to you.
Hotlines bring you fresh perspectives about love after dark with Shayla Ndukuma.
Minutes are for there to guide.